I'm going to resume. This workshop is part of a UN Trade and Development project entitled Advancing Consumer Information and Consumer Protection in Alignment with Multilateral Environmental Agreements through a synergetic partnership between UNEP and UNCTAD. The UN Trade and Development leads the Consumer Information for Sustainable Consumption and Production Program as part of the One Planet Network 10-year framework programs in partnership with the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection of Germany and Consumers International. We're thrilled to have a distinguished panel to explore the interplay between consumer protection and environmental policies. Without further ado, let's begin with the opening remarks. We will start with a video address from Teresa Moreira, Head of Competition and Consumer Policies Branch at UNCTAD.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Distinguished experts, ladies and gentlemen, I am Teresa Moreira, the Head of the Competition and Consumer Policies Branch at UNCTAD. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to our workshop on reviewing consumer protection in multilateral environmental agreements. The triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss requires decisive and immediate action. Since consumption represents around 60% of the world's GDP, it is easy to see the pivotal role that consumer markets can play in environmental protection through the encouragement of sustainable practices. Producers should offer more eco-friendlier alternatives to nudge consumers to more sustainable choices. This market-driven approach aligns economic incentives with environmental goals, promoting a sustainable future while still fostering economic growth. To make markets work for the people and the planet, all policies in government's toolkits must be adjusted to be fit for purpose. At UNCTAD, we looked into this issue in our 2023 publication on competition and consumer policies for sustainability. And now we are taking a step forward. Through a synergistic partnership between the UN Environmental Programme and UNCTAD, the UN Trade and Development body, we are promoting consumer information and consumer protection aligned with multilateral environmental agreements. This is the subject of a new technical cooperation project implemented by UNCTAD and funded by UNEP, which aims, amongst other things, to map and reveal the impact that selected multilateral environmental agreements have on consumers' lives and their implications for all relevant stakeholders: consumer protection agencies, consumer groups, business, and academia. We also aim to explore the ways in which consumer protection instruments and initiatives, that is to say, regulations, education and information campaigns, dispute resolution and redress mechanisms, enforcement, and international cooperation, can support the full implementation of these treaties. Our workshop will link theoretical understanding with practical impact, highlighting how multilateral environmental agreements influence consumer policies and how empowered consumers can shape these agreements. Consumer protection takes on various dimensions in this context. It encompasses ensuring that products are safe, that services are sustainable, and that consumers' rights and choices are respected and expanded in an environmentally constrained world. As such, we advocate for rules and regulations that not only protect our natural habitat, but also ensure that consumers are informed, engaged, and positively impacted by these measures. Today, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts to discuss the critical intersection of consumer rights and environmental responsibility. We will address key multilateral agreements such as the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we will examine their direct and systemic implications for consumer protection, how they influence product safety, consumer choice and information, and the overall quality of life. We will not only discuss these issues, but also identify the ways to promote and enhance consumer engagement and protection under these multilateral environmental frameworks. We aim to encourage a dynamic exchange of ideas and views that can lead to better integrated approaches to consumer protection within the environmental context. I am very pleased about the dialogue we are set to have today, which I believe will deepen our collective understanding and inspire action towards more robust integration of consumer protection into our global environmental efforts. UNCTAD, as the focal point for consumer protection issues within the United Nations system, is committed to supporting more effective consumer policies in our wide membership, and we will continue doing so in the context of the revised United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection, the key reference for our policy advice and advocacy work, ensuring that consumer rights are respected globally, particularly in the context of environmental sustainability. I am confident that together we can forge actionable strategies that respect both our environmental responsibilities and our commitment to protect consumers. So I look forward to our discussions and to collaborating with all of you on developing these essential strategies. I wish you a very successful workshop. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have the pleasure of giving the floor to Jorge Laguna Celis, head of the One Planet Network. Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arnau, and dear friends that have taken the time to join us today for this first series of discussions and part of a workshop, a process, as has been already announced and presented very eloquently by Teresa and also by yourself, Arnau, in your opening remarks, that seeks to address the important issue of revealing consumer protection in multilateral environmental agreements. For one, I am delighted to see this title, and I'm delighted to see the topic that has brought us today. And I see that we are almost close to 50 experts that have taken time in your agendas to come participate in this conversation. I also want to recognize and highlight the important role, the leading role that UNCTAD plays, and the efforts that UNCTAD has undertaken to foster a closer cooperation, participation, and engagement of national consumer protection authorities, particularly in addressing and achieving the objectives of the global environmental agendas. It is this partnership between trade and environment that UNEP seeks to strengthen and foster through the work that we are discussing today. I think we're all convinced that the world and the international community needs ambitious treaties and ambitious multilateral environmental agreements that help us address the challenges of our time. And today, I am pleased to see around the table representatives from three of the most important multilateral, so-called multilateral environmental agreements or conventions that focus on the intersection of the human and the environment. We have today with us the Climate Convention, Biodiversity Convention, the Basel and Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions represented and engaged. So together we work to collectively support better lives. The question that has been often raised and asked is, what is the role of consumer empowerment and protection under the global environmental agenda? And how can we better support and discuss how we can, as institutions and organizations and programs, support the implementation of these multilateral environmental agreements through a perspective of consumption, by thinking the role, the influence, and the practices that consumer has, and in the information policies and consumer information policies, the role that they play in the implementation of these important agreements. The lessons that we develop in this project not only will help us be more nimble in serving our stakeholders, but also will give us important findings and lessons learned for important processes that are undergoing. For example, in the case of the ongoing negotiations of a plastic treaty, which an international environmental and international negotiating committee is currently taking place in Ottawa. So in this regard, I do welcome the opportunity to hold this constructive dialogue on the topic with the close partners of the secretariats of the 3 multilateral environmental conventions that I already referenced. We are very thankful for your engagement today. As you know, the 10YFP, the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, was established with a strong momentum and a mandate to provide solutions to support governments and stakeholders move towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production as a means to address the triple planetary crisis. And as it has already been recognized, we work through programs and coalitions. In particular, today, we recognize the role of the Consumers Information Program, which is led by a number of partners which are with us today and participating, including by the Federal Ministry of Environment of Germany, Consumers International, and of course, the leading important role of UNCTAD, which has already been mentioned. This program plays an essential role in the implementation of the global strategy on sustainable consumption and production, and is precisely working in empowering consumers to make informed choices and protect them from unfair business practices. Consumer protection agencies thus play a critical role in these activities. In conclusion, I want to highlight that our discussions today will also be supported by important tools and resources that have been developed in the framework of the Consumer Information Program. We don't start from scratch. In particular, the product sustainability guidelines and principles, which are focused on ensuring reliable, relevant, clear, transparent, and accessible product information, which have been widely used and accepted as a tool to incentivize more sustainable businesses and empower consumers. This is an important component as well as we discuss the implementation of important legal frameworks, such as those that UNCTAD is advancing on behalf of the United Nations. I will stop at that because I am very eager to continue and to hear the experts and their insights. And I want to give back the floor to you, Arnau, and to thank once again each and every one of you for being part of the beginning of this important project.
Thank you so much, Jorge, for setting the scene. I hope you're all as excited as I am in this sort of meeting of worlds of consumer protection and environmental protection. First of all, let me present our distinguished speakers. We've got with us Dr. Laura Best, international expert on consumer protection, competition and consumer policies branch of UNCTAD. She's also our consultant in this project. We have with us Manoush Azodi, program officer and science and technical assistance branch in the Secretariat of Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions at UNEP. We've got Bianca Brazil, program manager, a business engagement, mainstreaming, and action agenda of the Convention on Biological Diversity, also at UNEP. And finally, Niklas Svenningsen, manager and program coordinator at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We will start with the discussion inviting Laura Best, our expert, to set the scene by explaining how we can relate these two topics, multilateral environmental agreements and consumer protection. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arno, and greetings to colleagues. I'm really looking forward to our collective wisdom this afternoon or this evening or this morning, and our experiences that can inform this road that we're all co-traveling together. So just starting with a bit of context, of course, figures will always differ, but if we work with a ballpark, there are between 4 and 5 billion consumers active in the market, making choices every day and buying for themselves and on behalf of household members and dependents. So that is quite a significant and powerful possibility that rests in those decisions that are being made every day. And I think the Stockholm Convention website said it perfectly for Earth Day when they said that individual actions matter. And I think that is exactly what a consumer is. A consumer is an individual. But when you look at consumers holistically, there's such capacity and momentum to harness that, to expand and deepen the intentions of the different conventions that have been mentioned today. And that's what our work is today, is to tease out and examine those intersections and see how do we massify them? How do we make them more than what they are in each of them in their individual capacities? So what baselines are we working from then? Let's start, if I may, with consumer protection. And I'd like to kick us off with a reminder of the global consumer rights that exist, because I think these are incredibly powerful as a baseline. I'll just run through the 8 of them. It's the right to safety. It's the right to be informed. It's the right to consumer education. It's the right to choose. It's the right to be heard. It's the right to redress. It's the right to satisfaction of basic needs. And it's the right to a healthy, and I would add, sustainable environment. Those are the 8, a very, very powerful basis that we have. Secondly, and Teresa referenced these, there are the United Nations guidelines on consumer protection. And there are very important provisions in those guidelines. Now, colleagues may know that these guidelines are a product of consensus, but they are regularly reconsidered, because annually there's what's convened by UNCTAD as the Intergovernmental Group of Experts on Consumer Protection Policy and Law, and that's a multi-stakeholder environment. So there's a lot of dynamism around the guidelines, and I think that's an opportunity for us to just flag in this bigger debate that we're having. But the principles inform very strongly consumer protection policy and what must be the legitimate needs of consumers that must be met. So they're a baseline. The 2 that obviously speak very directly to what we're discussing today in the guidelines is firstly the protection of consumers from hazards to their health and safety, and secondly the promotion of sustainable consumer patterns. Very powerful. They've been there for a long time in the guidelines. But there are also additional enabling provisions which bring these to life. And they have been touched on a bit, but I'd like to pause on them. The first is access by consumers to adequate information so that they can make informed decisions and choices. The second is consumer education. And importantly, it's specified in the guidelines that this includes education on the environmental, social, and economic consequences of consumer choice. And thirdly is the availability of effective consumer dispute resolution and redress. And that's something which we may not go into today, but I think it's something that we need to think about is what happens if consumers mobilize collectively and begin to look at a kind of class action around some of the contraventions of some of the conventions? Is there room for redress in disputes of that magnitude? Now, these 3 that I've just mentioned, the information, the education, and the dispute resolution are very important consumer protection policy tools. And I think that we should hold on to those because they have very strong similarities with the provisions in the different conventions. While the conventions don't necessarily specify impact for consumers, I think because they talk more about duties on parties, I think that the broadness of consumers means that they must be impacted by the conventions, particularly contraventions of the conventions. So one example of that, for example, in relation to consumer information would be the Rotterdam Convention in relation to labeling. That's very significant in terms of information for consumers and educating consumers, and it serves as a basis for consumers to mobilize around. So we're already seeing that there are existing provisions in conventions which impact directly onto consumers and consumer protection. There are 2 others of the guidelines which I would also just like to mention, which may not seem direct, but which I think are very important. And that the first one is the freedom for consumers to form relevant groups or organizations, because that provision then says that provides the opportunity for organizations to present their views in decision-making around processes that affect them. So in other words, it mobilizes and harnesses consumer voice. And I'll come back to how I think that can be done in relation to the conventions a bit later. And the last one I wish to mention in the guidelines is the protection of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers. And I think that this is particularly important because this is what makes for inclusion and also a more caring and kinder world. And I think that that's what unites us today in this conversation. We all are actually aiming for that. So I would like us just to have that as something which undergirds our thinking and our consciousness as we discuss. Now, what are the baselines then within the convention? If I just look at the three, the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam and the Stockholm Convention, it's so clear how the three of them speak about human health and the protection of the environment. So one doesn't even need to think about it. It's there, it's stated, it's the obvious. But my sense is that the conventions, had they been perhaps crafted in more recent times, they would have also spoken a lot more directly about sustainability. And I think that that would then create another link to the consumer protection guidelines, which talk about sustainable production and consumption. So I think, again, it's there, but I think it's for us to surface it. Now, what then do the conventions do if we try and find the bridge into the consumer rights that I spoke about in the beginning? Well, they clearly enable consumers to claim their right to safety, and they clearly enable consumers to claim their rights to a healthy and sustainable environment. However, those are obvious, and I think there's a lot of work that's been happening around those, and some of the introductions have referred to that. But I think there are other very interesting compliance requirements in the conventions, which we could look at to see how do we make these a space for consumers and for consumer protection. The first one probably sounds very boring, but I think it's very critical. And that is the reporting obligations on parties in the different conventions. Because obviously the reports that are being produced contain a huge amount of information. But my sense is that a lot of that information goes quite formulaically into very formal spaces where the parties are, rather than necessarily being firstly produced in consultation with stakeholders and particularly consumers, but secondly, perhaps being availed very broadly to consumers and perhaps in ways that are more accessible. And then I go back to, for example, your vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers. Any of the party reports into the convention spaces, how understandable, how accessible are they to vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers in particular, but to all consumers generally? That's a fantastic opportunity in my view, to expand consumer voice and to perhaps even change how the content of reporting and give it a different slant and a different flavor. The other very powerful provision that I've seen in some of the conventions is the possibility to grant observer status at meetings and proceedings, such as the Conference of Parties. Now, I'm sure it's already happening that UN agencies, because there are those provisions, that UN agencies are laterally, sort of horizontally integrating in those spaces. And that's fantastic. And the work that we're doing already will feed into that. But I'm hoping that we can also make sure that those observer statuses also are looked into by consumer organizations. And that's why I highlighted the guideline, which says consumers should form organizations. Again, I will touch on the IGE meeting that UNCTAD hosts and say that That's been going for a couple of years, and it's really expanded in its form and its content to move from being just quite a sort of structured formal space where member states were, to being a very vibrant multi-stakeholder platform, which includes consumer organizations, it includes researchers, and I think it's my own view, it's not tested in research, but I think it's really deepened the whole consumer protection debate and broadened its understanding and widened its participation. I think the same thing can happen with the existing conventions provisions for observer status. Of course, for that to happen, there must be activation of the consumer tool of consumer education, because so that consumers know what the issues are that conventions are dealing with, that are coming up in the reports, and that they want to come and have voice about at those meetings. So there's a critical need for that to happen, in my view, which again touches on the right of consumers to information and to education. Again, I've heard that there are programs where that's happening. The ones around waste, for example, are inspirational. Let's think more which other ones can happen for that to be expanded. So if we move towards actively adopting and building a more multi-stakeholder inclusive approach, I think that would really amplify important work in fulfilling the provisions of the conventions. And in doing so, I think that consumers, complementarily to that, become critical players in agitating for implementation and compliance with the conventions. So it's almost, it's a two-way street. It's a quid pro quo. The stakeholder, the conventions achieve their goals, but more so the implementation and the compliance with that ripples out much wider and hopefully gives impetus and energy to compliance. Now, I think just gleaning perhaps from the Basel Convention, there are other ways in which we can get immediate gains with this intersection between consumer protection and the conventions. The easy one, of course, is training and capacitation. And I think the 14 regional and sub-regional centers that the MEA secretariats have established are a huge resource and platform for integrating consumer education into those spaces. And doing all sorts of interesting work around technology transfers, even, and looking at how do you manage hazardous waste and other wastes, and minimization of, with consumers being able to contribute into that. And of course, the other critical stakeholder is business, who is referred to and must do that too. The other aspect would be national legislation development, encouraging consumer involvement when legislation linked to the conventions is being drafted in countries. Make sure that a consumer perspective is incorporated there. Also, research, development, and innovation. That is a provision, for example, in the Basel Convention, looking at the development of new environmentally sound low-waste technologies as one example, which colleagues would know about. And I think, again, if I may reference UNCTAD, there's been a very interesting mechanism called the Research Partnership Platform, which has been set up and kind of in addition to enrich the work of the IGE, where academics, researchers, policymakers are invited in to present research, which again cascades into consumer protection and policy. I have not heard, and Arnaud and Valentina, you would correct me, I've not heard research being presented at the RPP directly related to the conventions, but I think it might be a quick win to look at how we could do that if that hasn't already happened. Now, colleagues, I'd like to move towards the conclusion and say that I think there's so much that we can build out from the existing work within UNCTAD and the secretariats and the other spaces within UNEP that host this kind of work. For instance, I would really love to see, because it seems to be something that pops up in the work that everyone's doing, I'd love to see an overlay of the respective e-mappings that's happening in UNCTAD, in the secretariats, and the dashboards that are tracking country and global developments. What would it look like if we brought that all together, all that multi-dimensionality? They exist, and it would be quick and fun to do that. The other possibility that's a quick win, and I think this project is enabling, is combined and integrative technical assistance, where we go in deliberately with technical assistance and we invite in as participants government officials from the different regulatory agencies and departments, which might actually be doing very well in their vertical responsibilities, but we bring them in with a joint technical capacity, and we do that horizontal integration so that the environmental is wrapped around the consumer protection and the other way around. Again, I think it's there for the taking. And doing this, I think, will really bring new knowledges and hopefully implementation innovations. I'm sure of that. It will certainly massify and expand the impact of both the conventions and the United Nations guidelines on consumer protection, and how those work together to impact on the triple global climate challenges that were spoken about. And of course, towards the achievement of the SDGs, notably number 7 and number 12 around responsible consumption and production. And in the long run, I think that all that work will be in the interest of a fairer, a kinder, and a more just world in which the needs of the most vulnerable are centered. So that to me is really the motivation for expanding and building this intersect between UNCTAD's consumer protection mandate and the Secretariat's mandates regarding the conventions. That's how we can multiply and broaden the impact and sharpen the consumer protection tools as key levers in that process. So colleagues, those are just some few ideas. There's a lot more, and I'm so glad that we're going to be preparing a much more in-depth document about this, which will hopefully be made available broadly. And I look forward to colleagues' responses and ideas, and I would like to thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for setting the scene and talking about this virtuous triangle between environmental protection, consumer protection, and sustainability, which really is what we're trying to find and chart here. I would like to invite our speakers to expand further on this topic in their respective fields of expertise. And for these, we have 3 questions we would like to ask our speakers, and we hope we can cover this in the next 80 minutes. The first question is, can you share concrete ways in which the convention that your Secretariat serves impacts consumers, and what more can be done to expand this impact? I would like to invite Manoush Azodi, representing the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions at UNEP. Could you please briefly introduce these conventions and explain the concrete ways in which these conventions impact consumers? Manoush, over to you.
Thanks, Arno. Thank you, Dr. Laura. It was really great to listen to you, and a lot of things that I'm gonna say today on behalf of the Secretariat of Basel, Rotterdam, and the Stockholm Convention were already reflected in what Dr. Laura already presented. So yeah, today I'm representing the triple conventions, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, and we're really pleased to be part of this project and dialogue. To start, I'll give a brief introduction to each of the triple conventions, and for each of them, I would say how that would have implications for consumer protection. I think first and foremost, the triple conventions, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, really, in my opinion, lay the groundwork for consumer protection. So they are the foundational upon which we could then do more for consumers and protecting their right to know and their right to a healthy environment. For instance, overall, the triple conventions are these internationally legally binding frameworks that regulate the transboundary movement and safe and sustainable management and disposal of some of the most hazardous chemicals and waste globally. Starting with the Stockholm Conventions. Stockholm Convention basically aims to eliminate the production and use, as well as import and export of some of the most hazardous and toxic chemicals, among which the very significant one group of chemicals is a persistent organic pollutants. Persistent organic pollutants, as their name says, are a group of organic substances that persist in the environment, bioaccumulate in living organisms, and they are a very major risk to human health and also to the environment. They are transported by air, by water, by migratory species, and they're often found in places in the world where those hazardous substances have never been introduced or used. So for some of these, I'm sure you've heard, for instance, pesticides such as DDT, or some industrial chemicals, legacy chemicals such as PCBs that used to be used in electrical transformers or other electrical equipments. And so you have also the unintentional byproducts that are produced during industrial processes, such as dioxin and furans. So overall, the Stockholm Conventions has listed 34 chemicals, persistent organic pollutants, and those are chemicals that then the provisions of the convention are applied to them. So these provisions tries to remove and eliminate these POPs from products and industrial processes worldwide. So the convention, as part of its work, supports the manufacturing of POPs-free products and introduction of alternatives and substitutes to POPs in industrial processes and in products worldwide. So you can see that if we're able and succeeding in removing of these POPs from the production chain, then we actually can promote the safe recycling of waste that could contain these hazardous products. One concrete example of the work of convention that is now ongoing is that Stockholm Convention is trying to identify POPs in products and articles through labeling. It may appear easy that, well, where POPs are produced and now where they're going to end up, but it's actually a very challenging task to know where these POPs are applied in some products, given that a lot of them are also, like I said, like dioxins and furans are byproducts, unintentional. So there was a decision in the Conference of Parties to the Stockholm Convention, Decision 11/12, that the COP mandated the POPs Review Committee. It's a committee that reviews regularly the listed hazardous substances and may list new ones in the future, and every time they meet, to develop a report. In that report, they're supposed to outline options to identify POPs in stockpiles, in products, in articles in use, and in waste. And the aim is really to ensure their safe handling and disposal. Based on that decision, so Secretariat has been collecting information and has received a lot of submissions from the parties. And there's going to be a draft report soon before the OEWG that is in end of June in Geneva. So this work of the Stockholm Convention, you see that it has direct implications because it is on labeling. And so it can also has indirect implications because this can become and can contribute to a future mechanism under a new instrument on plastic waste. As we speak, and you're all aware, more than 170 countries are right now in Ottawa negotiating a new treaty on plastic waste. But until them finalizing that new treaty, Basel Convention is the only legally binding treaty that is overseeing the trade of plastic waste. Some of the POPs are in the plastic that becomes waste. So you can see that this ongoing work of a Stockholm Convention trying to label those POPs can also contribute to the work of coming up with a new mechanism under the new plastic waste treaty to ensure the transparency of traceability of hazardous chemicals in plastics. So moving on to the Basel Convention, the Basel Convention has three main pillars. First is to minimize waste generation. Second is to environmentally sound management of hazardous waste and other waste. And then the third is the control of their transboundary movement. So the waste prevention and minimization of the Basel Convention promotes basically fundamental change in the business and consumer attitude and behavior. It's like a paradigm shift asking to industries to try to not generate waste and basically do a different type of product design for that matter. Another concrete example under the Basel Convention is the plastic waste amendments. I'm sure you're all familiar with those. They were adopted in 2019 and came into force in 2021. Before Basel Convention plastic waste amendments, Basel Convention didn't consider plastic waste as hazardous waste. However, after these amendments came into force, now the plastics waste are categorized into three legal categories: hazardous waste, other waste, and non-hazardous waste. So basically, shipment of plastic waste from one country to another that is listed as hazardous waste or other waste is subject to the convention's extensive control system. So this control system includes application of a prior informed consent mechanism, an application to ensure environmentally sound management, authorization requirements for traders and processors, mandatory packaging, labeling, and transport requirements, information transmission requirements, and even an obligation to re-import when environmentally sound management of plastic waste cannot be completed. So you can see this had a very big implication for consumers around the world and for a lot of countries when this was decided and adopted. Some of the countries probably you've heard in the news and in the media banned import of plastic waste into their countries. That's not what the amendments directly asks, but that was kind of a direct reaction when this was adopted. Another way that Basel Convention is specifically addressing the consumer protection is the PACE2, is a partnership for action on challenges relating to e-waste. And it focuses on specific consumer products such as mobile phones, computing equipment, TV screens, and audio and video equipment, refrigerators, cooling and heating equipment. So the PACE2 partnership works with consumer associations. They also closely work with youth and youth associations and youth group, and they try to educate especially this group of people. They have done several projects, and we're also still doing more projects. Some of them, for instance, is on awareness raising among communities and students about collection and separation of e-waste. Another project has been on building contractual arrangements for the e-equipment, come up with take-back obligations, and leasing instead of purchasing the equipment. So you can see another direct thing that the Basel Convention is trying to address or target consumers on that front. So overall, the convention also promotes environmentally sound management of waste. And one of the things that convention is trying to promote a lot is extended producer responsibility. And we've been working on that front a lot, especially when it relates to plastic waste. And it promotes and supports countries to come up with the take-back or collection systems where the manufacturers take responsibility for the end of life of products. And finally, the last but not the least is the Rotterdam Convention. This one is a treaty that manages a wide range of chemicals in international trade. For instance, it covers pesticides and industrial chemicals that are banned or severely restricted because of the impacts they have on human health or environment by the parties. So the parties come forward notifying the convention for the inclusion of these hazardous substances in the prior informed consent procedure. So that procedure then requires the parties to the convention to inform the importing state of the nature of those hazardous substances and ensure that the importing state is aware and actually consents to have those hazardous substances and knows how to manage them soundly. And the convention also promotes exchange of information on a voluntary basis on a very broad range of chemicals. And as you can see, these two mechanisms really do have direct and indirect implications then for consumer products that may contain a lot of these hazardous substances. So to basically wrap up, from the viewpoint of these triple conventions, the knowledge of the presence of hazardous substances in products is crucial for their proper management, including prevention and minimization of waste that may contain these hazardous substances. So the triple conventions really look at the greater access to information and knowledge of flows, risk, and management of chemicals in products. And that in turn improve the possibility for substitution of hazardous substances and would also enable producers, suppliers, and consumers within the supply chain to make an informed choice. So to conclude, the BRS Convention can contribute to the consumer's needs by several means, similar to what United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection defines. For instance, like I said, it protects consumers from hazards to their health and safety, access of consumers to adequate information and data that would enable them to make informed choices, opportunity for consumer organizations to present their views and come to the decision-making processes, to the cups of the triple conventions and contribute to the policies that are made that would directly affect the lives of the consumers, and to promote sustainable protection patterns. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Manoj. I will ask the same question to Bianca Brazil, representing the Convention on Biological Diversity, or known as CBD, at UNEP. Can you please introduce the CBD and present concrete ways in which the CBD impact consumers, and of course, how this impact can be expanded? Over to you, Bianca.
Thank you so much, Arnau, and thank you for having me, and thank you to the other panelists, because this has been great, actually, to be able to learn from these other organizations and to discuss this topic. The Convention on Biological Diversity focuses on the Convention on Conservation, Sustainable Use, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic diversity. Among the drivers of biodiversity loss, as identified by IPBES assessment, are invasive alien species, land and use change, pollution, direct exploitation, and climate change. Many of these are heavily driven by unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. The Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted in 2022 and is set out to address many of these underlying issues, including we have a dedicated target on pollution, for example, including plastic pollution and excess nutrients. Invasive alien species is addressed. Harvesting and trade of wildlife and products arising from biodiversity. And most notably, a dedicated target to encourage and enable business to monitor, assess, and disclose impacts on biodiversity, but also provide information needed for consumers to promote sustainable consumption patterns, and a dedicated target to enable sustainable consumption choices to reduce overconsumption and waste, including halving food waste by 50%. It is also worth noting that the framework acknowledges interlinkages between biodiversity and health and the three objectives of the convention. The framework is to be implemented with consideration of the One Health approach. So to deliver on these targets, countries are working now to translate all of these targets into policies and frameworks. And of course, we expect that this will trigger a much needed transformation on how we produce and how we consume goods and services. we need to involve all economic sectors, and there is a process with the CBD Secretariat for ample participation. We had different stakeholders participating in the development of the what we called back then at the post-2020, but in the adoption of the GBF as well. The Global Biodiversity Framework also, which now we're calling the Biodiversity Plan for Life on Earth, also addressed, for example, the role of indigenous peoples, local communities, youth, women and girls. And the idea is that this framework is going to be a whole of society and a whole of government approach, which means interaction between several sectors of government and on different levels of government, but also the role that society has to play in all this. Civil society through organizations, transparency mechanisms that civil society helps to implement, the role of consumers, of course, and then I think the biggest challenge there is going to be how to encourage, enable, and support governments when they're establishing these frameworks, but also how to integrate in education systems the role of sustainable consumption, how to make consumers more aware. I think parties to the CBD Secretariat, to the CBD Convention, they actually were very, very sensitive to that topic, because the sustainable consumption actually shows in two different targets on two different occasions. Target 15, which calls out for businesses to look into those impacts and then reduce them over time. There is a component there also that governments should also enable consumers and enable businesses and demand from businesses actually to share information on the products, to make this information available. So I think it's a step forward in terms of what our convention has been doing in that sense. I'm sure you know that sustainable consumption and production was mentioned in Aichi biodiversity targets. However, the ABTs, they were not fully met. And one of the key issues we identified was actually at the time the lack of involvement of society and of different groups. When the Aichi targets were developed, there was a heavy involvement of parties, but mostly parties. What we tried to do when developing the Global Biodiversity Framework was to actually integrate different stakeholders. Business had a role to play, and there was a great participation on that side, providing inputs, participating in the negotiating meetings, providing suggestions on which direction the parties should go, and so forth. And I think this also shows that there is an interest from both sides. Parties want to hear what the economic sectors have to say, but economic sectors also want to know what role they need to play. So I think all in all, the convention is now open, and parties are looking into these targets, trying to figure out how to translate those into national targets, how to adapt and include all of these new targets into their revised national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And I think we will see lots of opportunities moving forward in terms of collaboration, in terms of support, etc. I'll stop here because I know we are pressed for time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bianca. And of course, you're very knowledgeable about the relationship between biodiversity and consumption, because you're leading our working group on this issue in the One Planet Network. Thank you very much for your introduction. Now I would like to move to my last speaker, and I would like to ask Niklas Svenningsen from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Niklas, can you please provide a brief introduction of the convention and explain the concrete ways in which it impacts consumers and how this impact can be expanded? Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Anu, and thank you so much for this opportunity to share a little bit of thoughts and perspectives from the UN Climate Change Convention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on explaining the convention, because I think most people probably know a little bit about what we're doing and who we are. But fundamentally, in a nutshell, UNEP-UNCTAD is about trying to prevent climate change to reach such levels that they will have severe harmful impact on society and our planet. So specifically, we have established in the Paris Agreement from 2015, 1.5 degrees Celsius targets. It's a stretch target. The absolute target is 2.0 degrees Celsius. So that is the amount of climate change that we can live with, we believe, above pre-industrial levels. Now, what does this really mean? Well, it's much more than just, controlling emission of greenhouse gases. It's not a specific chemical or a specific substance or banning certain types of activities that talking about. Instead, what we're trying to achieve effectively is to entirely change the way that we run our societies. So it's not, we're looking at infrastructure, on buildings, on transport, on energy, production and consumption, of course, is also there. But we also need to look on the sinks, on the natural habitats, on the ocean, forest, nature, and so on. So in principle, we're working with all this. So how do we achieve this? Well, fundamentally, I will repeat this later, the source to climate change are human beings. All climate change is caused by human beings. So we need to change the way we're doing things. And in order to do that, we need to establish the right policies. We need to ensure that there's capacity building, knowledge, understanding, technology transfer, financing, etc. And that is where the UNEP-CCC focus really is. It is not so much on concrete specific tools and activities as it is trying to put in the global framework for our 198 parties, UNEP-CCC, to work together, to increase ambition and implement mitigation and adaptation activities in their legislations in their countries and in the regions. Now, a personal note here is that before I joined UNEP-CCC some 10 years ago, I was working on consumption and production in UNEP. And I did that because when I was working at UNEP, it was always very specific tools and projects and things that you were working on. But many times when you left your project, it fell apart because there was no long-term policy support. So I went over to UNEP-CCC to work on policy, and oh my God, indeed, this is what we're doing. We do work on policies, but you will not find so much these concrete tools. We rarely talk about practical measures, and if you go into UNEP-CCC and you're trying to find a sustainable consumption tool, you may be a little bit disappointed. You will have heard from our COPs, for example, in Dubai last year, we had decisions about phasing out oil, double renewable energy, triple energy efficiency. We talked about loss and damage and just transition and so on. And all that is good, but it's still at the very high policy level. Now, this wouldn't be true if there were not exceptions to what I just said. And I would say that there are a few examples of more concrete work we're doing that really addresses consumers and speaks also to the global consumer rights rules that we have. And I want to mention 3 or 4. And the first is an area we call Action for Climate Empowerment. This is a foundational part of UNEP-CCC that is about education, training, rights to information, and rights to engage in climate action by all citizens. And this is very important because if you don't know about climate change, if you don't have the tools and the information, what can you do about it? There's another part that is a growing part in our work, I would say, which is sectoral work, where we're working with sectors that are not well regulated globally or naturally, but still have a big climate impact. So, for example, fashion, sports, entertainment, meetings, this kind of work, we actually have direct work with the different stakeholders in these sectors, that we are trying to encourage them and support them to move towards climate neutrality under the overall sort of framework of UNEP-CCC. We also have some long-term established bodies and networks, such as a Clean Technology Center network that is helping countries to identify what exactly are the tools that they need to achieve mitigation, but also adaptation, which also means that it speaks both on the production and the consumption side. And finally, the Paris Committee on Capacity Building is also looking at how do we build capacity on, for example, consumer information tools that can help people understand and relate and engage in climate action. So this is maybe UNEP-UNCTAD at a glance, but to respond to your second part of the question, what can be done to expand the impact of these tools? Well, our main lever is policymaking, and right now in our negotiations are two main things. One is climate finance, and it's a truth that if you don't have the money, if you don't have the finance, it will be extremely difficult to reach your targets. So at COP29, which will happen in November in Baku in Azerbaijan this year, the big issue there is really to define a new finance target. We call it the new common quantified goal on climate finance. And that would replace the old 100 billion targets with something much more nuanced and ambitious than we have today. The other part is ambition. So ambition by our parties to reduce their emissions, to implement adaptation measures, to support sustainable behavior among the whole population. And that is done through something we call naturally determined contributions. It's basically climate action plans for the natural levels. And the new version of them, they are supposed to be reported to us within the next 12 months. And by COP30, we are going to take a look at where we are with the NDCs. So these climate action plans, the NDCs today, they are supposed to bring down global emission by some 60% within the next 5-6 years. Where they are today, at best, is that we will stay at the emission levels we have today, which of course is not at all where we want to go. So more ambition is needed here. So what we are hoping for, and in our work, is that we're looking to parties to increase ambition. And then I will come back how to achieve that. But I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all my speakers for such thought-provoking interventions. I've been taking note. And before I move to the second question, we may not have time for a third one, but I would like to open the floor for any comments from the 45 participants we have today. If you would like to take the floor or write a comment or a question in the chat, please feel free. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to the next question, and that is to turn the question around. So we've learned of how do the conventions impact consumers and what are the direct and indirect ways that they do it. But since we're already talking about the consumer protection tools that they are in the government's policy toolkit, in your opinion, how can those tools be more impactful in the consecution or achievement of the conventions? And I would like to move to my first speaker, Manoj. If you could please talk to us about the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions at UNEP. How do you see consumer protection bringing closer the achievement of the conventions? Very shortly, in just 4 minutes, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, so I think that should happen in multiple fronts. And maybe some of the examples is, for instance, the work of a POP review committee under the Stockholm Convention on labeling that could alert the presence of hazardous substances in consumer products and in articles is one way, effective way of alerting the consumers and helping them to make informed choices. For instance, like I like this example. I know there are for sure other examples and tools. There's some tools developed, and I'm sure there, but one that I like is a Scan for Chem. This was developed with a European Union funding as part of Ask Reach project, and that is a mobile app that enables consumers, when they go shopping in a shop, they can scan the barcode of a product, like a toy, and that would send a request to the manufacturer or supplier, could be an importer, and asking them to provide information on the existence of any substances of very high concern, in line with the REACH and CLP of the European Union. So some of the substances of very high concern that are listed under the REACH and CLP actually are also listed in the Stockholm Convention. So you can see the link there. I'm sure there are other tools that other countries have developed similarly, but my point here is that information dissemination through these type of tools and promoting the existing tools, which already exist and the work has been done, could be helpful. And then one other point is the stricter and more effective compliance mechanisms, because we all have these regulations and policies in place, but often what we is challenging, what we struggle with, even within the BRS conventions, is really compliance. So how could we have policy tools that facilitate this? Regular inspections, penalties for non-compliance, incentives for states, companies, and businesses that are compliant. Then one thing that I always very much like and to always say, increase funding for research into safer chemical alternatives and more sustainable waste management technologies. We need more funding. There is funding, but we need a lot more of that to ensure that we can develop alternatives and phase out those POPs and other hazardous substances. Then another one, and I'm going to end with this, the foster international cooperation, and we can do that in two fronts. One is that that international cooperation be on the consumer policy, so that the states share best practices, data, and technological solutions. But also another one would be particular to the parties of the Basel, Rotterdam, and the Stockholm Convention, would be to really created cooperation dialogue for the parties to mainstream the consumer protection as an important pillar of the effectiveness of these triple conventions. So that could be even proposing a mechanism to more concretely track and make progress towards some well-defined objectives that are targeting consumer rights. And then at the end, the national consumer protection legislation at the national level, the states would come up with these obligations to basically prohibit the use of harmful chemicals, for instance, in children toys. Yeah, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manoush. I would now like to move to Bianca, representing CBD at UNEP. Bianca, how would you see consumer and consumer policy tools being more impactful for CBD?
Thank you, Arnau. It was mentioned earlier here, the critical need to ensure that sufficient financial resources are in place to ensure the successful implementation of these conventions and of strategies around the globe. This was actually for us, for the CBD Secretariat, a very sensitive issue during the negotiations of the framework. And continued work is actually being carried out to ensure that we are on track. There has been the establishment of a GBF fund through the GEF, which hopefully will help some of the countries to look into the policy tools and the mechanisms and the innovations that they need to implement or establish or develop in order to address all these issues. And I assume that sustainable consumption and production will have a very prevalent role. We also need to look into policy tools and mechanisms needed to support the sustainable consumption and production. And one good example, I think, that pops to mind is the directive being discussed in the US, in the EU, to tackle greenwashing. And this is a very good example how policy can shift, can help shift practices. We need the business sector to really assess their products, packaging, advertising, and identify solutions, meaningful ones, alternatives, and innovations that can make these products less impactful, from the sourcing to the delivery to the waste. They need to be less impactful, and they also need to provide proper and realistic information to their consumers. So if you want to have a sustainable product and communicate that, so then produce it sustainably and use that as an attribute to your product, to your brand, etc. I think we need also policies to be permeating the educational system on many different countries. This doesn't happen in the South. I have to tell you, I am from Brazil, and the role of sustainable consumption and the role that we have to play is never communicated accordingly. So I think this is an angle that we really need to look at, how the educational system can help, but also how companies have a responsibility in terms of educating their consumers. And I think finally, There was also a lot of discussion and consideration on the different realities that we see in the different countries. And this also needs to be realized, and it needs to be acknowledged. How can we set standards and practices for everyone? Well, not all countries have the same resources, ability, and possibility to act accordingly. So we will need really to look into national realities, and some countries will need more support than others. But I don't think we can do that in isolation. I think different sectors have different roles to play. We count on the civil society, NGOs, to help continue helping with developing tools and mechanisms that can help us amplify and strengthen transparency. We need them to be vigilant and to help us look for existing gaps and also solutions. We need the business sector to realize their role into this puzzle, and to be more forthcoming, to look into the way they produce, to transform the way they produce, to try and find alternatives. I know it's a challenge, but if anyone can do is the business sector, with all the resources and all the human resources also they have at hand. So I think I'll stop here. There are many things that we could go into detail, but I'm very, very mindful of the time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bianca. And now I would like to ask Nicholas the same question. How do you see the tools of consumer protection that are in the Consumer Protection Toolkit serving in the consecution of the convention? Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, like previous speakers, I think these tools has an enormous potential impact on the successful implementation of our conventions, and not least for UNEP-UNCTAD. As I mentioned earlier, we are working around in the policymaking sphere, but in most countries, the policymaking by governments is very much influenced by the public discourse and what consumers and voters are saying. And we have, for example, seen over the last 20 years that the discussions about climate change has moved from an area where we had a lot of skepticism and questions about even if climate change was a real thing, to a very proactive discussion that we have now, where you basically see climate change being considered in many, many different political and also personal choices and decisions that you're doing. You see this in the consumption choices, in public debates, in investments, in green company profiles, and even in some cases, going back to what Laura said earlier, court cases where governments have been now brought to court because they're not doing enough about this. Now, underpinning all this is education, training, and consumer awareness, and the tools that are delivered to this end. And there are some very good tools that are related specifically to climate. Just to give you one example, some 10 years ago, well, let me say, for some 10 years ago, if you buy a liter of milk, you will find a total description of what's in that package of milk in terms of how many kilocalories, how many vitamins, maybe even from what kind of cow you have got that milk. If you buy a house on the other side, there is no specification of what's inside. There's no information about the energy performance of that building, etc. Today, however, if you buy a building in most countries, you will have an energy labeling. You will have energy labeling for all the machines and your washing machines and stoves and everything that you will have inside that house. And we see that happening all over. So to respond to your questions, I believe that continued pushing the use of these tools. In some cases, you need to legislate it, but in many times it's just about making consumers aware that this information should be made available, and it would have an impact on the quality and the performance of the product or the service that they are buying. So I think if we can achieve that, if we can continue to push the wagon like this, we will also have a big help from these consumer tools in implementing the conventions as such. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And it is very clear how this picture is emerging. Before we come to an end to this very short but very intense panel, I would like to ask you a question that is coming from our colleague Rafael Regla from the Federal Attorney for Consumer Protection of Mexico. And he asks a very simple question. From the conventions themselves, what would be the key takeaways consumer should know about? So, and I'm asking this as a tricky question because you already explained in great detail how this comes, but I'm asking you in just 1 minute, if you're talking to a normal, regular consumer, what should they know about the conventions? And I'm going to start with Manoush first. So what is the takeaway that a consumer should take from the triple conventions? Over to you.
I think one of the things that I realized talking to a lot of people that whose background is not chemicals, they often find chemicals a very vague terminology, and they really don't know how it applies to their everyday life. But I think one important takeaway is that the chemicals and what the triple conventions are doing are affecting every individual in every corner of this planet Earth on a daily basis. Every single time that we go to a shop, even when we do our groceries, those fresh produce, fruits and vegetables, somewhere in the world, fertilizers, pesticides are used if they're not organic or bio, and that can affect that individual when they make that purchase on a daily basis. The building that they live in, the insulation that is used in there, the furnitures that they use. If it's wood, there's preservatives in them. If there are polymers, there are other type of chemicals in them. So in their cars, they're surrounded by chemicals. In their beauty products, in their toiletries every day. So that's the takeaway. So to conclude, the consumers should be aware of the presence of chemicals in their everyday life, and they should be aware of their right to information and the importance of access to public data and transparent information on products. And so the other thing is that to get engaged, to a study, read up on this, the presence of chemicals, maybe get used to read the list of ingredients when you purchase something. It's easier said than done. I myself have to make myself every day when I go to shop to read that list of ingredients and engage through your communities and civil society organization. The COPs, our Conference of Parties, are open to observers. The civil society organizations that represent the communities and consumers can come, be part of the discussion and policy making, and be part of those negotiations. I think these are the three things I could say is important for everybody to know. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Manoush. That's a very powerful message. And before I move on to my other speakers, I would like to read 2 comments in the chat. The first is from Stephen Fuller, who says that chemical restriction lists give consumers a false sense of security if the substitute has not been assessed to be safer. Due to the low numbers of assessed chemicals compared to the number available, not being listed mostly means the chemical hazard level is not known. So I think this is also in line with what you were saying, Manoush, about consumers beware and really be alert when you are purchasing. And I also have another comment, from Dr. Entisar El Farsi from the Bahrain Consumer Protection Authority, who says we have the right to know what pollutants make up part of the burden on our bodies, and to demand that the authorities and industrial producers of these substances take measures to prevent their formation and release into the environment. The burden of persistent toxic substances, such as persistent organic pollutants, on the body should not be accepted as an irreversible natural fact, as it violates the fundamental right to a quality of life characterized by human dignity. In particular, the presence of these substances in the human body violates women's reproductive rights, the right to pregnancy and breastfeeding away from pollutants, and the rights of children to a healthy diet and in conditions that allow for their full development. Thank you very much, Dr. Entisar, for your comments as well. I will move now to Bianca and ask the same questions. Very simple. What should consumers care about CBD? What is your message to a regular consumer? Over to you.
I think we are in a positive moment because nature is coming up in the agenda, not only for business but also for consumers. The markets for organics, the markets for more naturally produced ingredients and products is increasing. And I think that gives us a sense that people are more aware, people are more interested. Again, in the deforestation-free products, in all of these discussions, I think people are becoming more and more aware. I think we need to be very, very understanding of how information is shared. But if you are a consumer, you should probably look into the need for purchasing something or for consuming something. Do I really need that? And because everything, I think that we start from there. Everything that we consume has an impact on the planet. Be it smaller or be it bigger, it all has an impact. So whenever you're buying something, do I really need that? Is that really important? The food I eat, can I buy something that is local? Can I buy something that is not highly industrialized? So these are small things, small contributions that all of us can do every day in our lives. But sometimes we don't. So I think I'll leave it at that because it's such a complex, fascinating, but complex subject. I think it would take us another 3 hours to discuss on how the interactions between biodiversity and consumption.
Thank you so much, Bianca. So the first message was consumer beware. The second one is consumer be conscious. And this has also been a message that has been amplified at the recent Consumer European Summit in Brussels last week. Lastly, Nicholas, what do you think? What is the message you would like to transmit to a regular, ordinary consumer? What is the takeaway that he or she should take from the convention?
Okay, thank you. I think I will echo a little bit of what both Minusha and Bianca said, which is that we are all decision makers, and we all figure on both sides of the equation. We are both causing climate change and we are suffering from climate change. Like we're causing chemicals and waste and we're suffering from that. We're causing natural destruction and depletion of habitats and we're causing it. So that is a very important message, that every decision we take, from we get up in the morning until we go to bed in the evening, it has a cost, it has a consequence. Try to act responsible. But when it comes to relation to the convention, and in this case UNEP-UNCTAD, having now followed these negotiations for many, many years, we way too often see negotiators who actually don't really negotiate. They come to our COP and they state positions and they don't move. And then they come to the next COP and they state the same position and they don't move. The negotiators represent their governments, which are normally elected by people, by consumers. So I would also say that there's a good case for making your voice heard at home. You absolutely do not need to go to COP to have an influence, but you can talk with your politicians, engage politically, try to influence the domestic politics. That is the best way to achieve this global alignment, I would say, that will help us move forward in all these issues on climate change, chemicals, waste, and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. So I've got consumer beware, I've got consumer be conscious, I've got consumer be demanding as well. And this goes a bit in line with what Suroja is thinking and sharing, that it is unfair to burden the consumers alone, but the businesses and governments should be more accountable too. So all our decisions have an impact, and we also have to have access to sustainable choices. So that's also part of it. Let me now, in this last 4 minutes, share my conclusions of the event. I think this has been extremely interesting, at least for me. I hope it has been for the 50-odd people that have been in the conference as well. First of all, because, as I was saying, this is a kind of cross-fertilization for us. So it's a kind of an experiment, an exciting one. I think we've very well mapped what is the situation right now. And we hope in the next steps that we're taking to reveal, which is the other part of the interlinkages. So go deeper in what you already presented and see how consumer protection tools can really make a difference concretely, that will result into a guidance document that would look at these 3 bodies of multilateral environmental protection and guide policymakers, but not only policymakers that are sitting in the negotiating room of these conventions, also policymakers in consumer protection, because this is the field of expertise in UNCTAD. And there are some key takeaways that I'm already looking forward to discussing further with our experts here, but also with all participants. First is policymaking cooperation at international and at national levels. And we've heard about the possibility of influencing reporting, but also influencing policymaking. And this cross-sectoral or cross-ministerial participation of consumer protection authorities also contributing to the goals of the convention. The second is about education and information. And we've talked a lot about disclosing, making information available to consumers. And I think we should take up a notch to making that useful for consumers. If we get information overload, it might not be useful at all if we don't get the consumer to be nudged to a more sustainable choice. So it's also about applying the different tools that we know work, such as behavioral insights or third-party schemes that can enhance the effectiveness of that disclosure and information to consumers. Third, and we've touched upon this, is about business engagement. So not only having a sustainable choice, but having a sustainable access. So not only the consumer part, but also the business part of putting that into the market and how to better engage those businesses into leading to more sustainable choices. Finally, or rather, the fourth would be about enforcement. So we've worked a lot, and the One Planet Network has been excellent already in providing business guidance on how to improve their practices. This goes in lines with the 3 conventions. We could also talk, and the One Planet Network is already started working on this, on greenwashing, for example, how to take the incentives also to the sanction part, how to make sure that the consumer protection regulations on misleading advertising are respected also in regards to the conventions. And finally, an issue that we haven't touched upon so much yet, although Laura had made already reference before, is redress and dispute resolution. So we're looking at easy ways that consumers can enforce their rights to sustainability and to the rights that derive from the conventions, but also collective redress. And I'm thinking about, of course, the Dieselgate that happened. How can that really bring the rights that derive from environmental protection into mass consumer awareness? And that can bring market change to the patterns that we see today. Stay tuned. We will be getting more input from you. We're going to take notes, get all this collective wisdom that Laura was describing in the beginning, repolishing a guidance document that will be circulated both through UNCTAD channels, but also One Planet Network channels. And finally, let me tell you that you are all invited to send comments and inputs to feed our guidance note, so the result of this discussion, to the emails in the chat. And I hope that Valentina is putting those emails, who are Valentina and Laura, for our contact. We would also be grateful if you could fill the satisfaction survey that you will receive at the end of the meeting in the email with which you registered. And with this message, I close the workshop, and I thank the panelists for their commitment, expertise, and contributions. And please join me on a virtual round of applause to all our speakers. So thank you very much, colleagues. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you today. Stay safe and see you very soon. Thank you and goodbye.